When I was an undergraduate, long, long time ago, as they say, in a galaxy far, far away, I went to Boston University, private university, and my family's finances collapsed. And so, unexpectedly, I found myself having to pay for my own college education. The cost at the time was about $1,500. I worked in the summer, I had a part-time job, and took advantage of Cold War fellowships fed to students who wanted to study Russian, as I did. And I managed to take care of that cost. In today's money, that would be about $10,000. But BU's tuition today is $47,000. Just tuition, just for 1 year. I would need a really good summer job to be able to cover those expenses. The average cost for a private institution at a 4-year university now is $31,000, just tuition. We're not talking about living. The average cost at a public 4-year university is $22,000 for out-of-state, just over $9,000 for in-state. For those of you that don't already know it, the University of Pittsburgh's in-state tuition, one of the highest in the nation, is more than $17,000 a year. We're in a situation in which the disparity, the ratio between the cost of this education and the income of those who are purchasing it has gone wildly out of whack. In addition, the disparity between costs for a private institution and public is similarly tremendously skewed. What seems to be happening is that, and I'm going to ask my panelists, whom I promise you I will introduce, what seems to be happening is that this cost, especially at private institutions, is reinforcing rather than overcoming class and social divisions in our country. There are schools for the rich, and there are schools for everybody else. At the micro level, and here I would like my first slide, we have a huge increase in the amount of student debt. According to an article in the Wall Street Journal, which will be emerging momentarily, average debt for a graduate from the class of 2015 was $35,000. You can see the increase there. Can I have the next slide, please? One of the other things that happen is that more students are taking on such debt, from less than half 10 years ago to around 3/4 now. What is the impact of such cost and such debt? First, it suppresses individual capacity to use funds once they do graduate. It has what you might call knock-on effects. People put off buying homes, investing in durables. They have debt to pay, and they can't afford such purchases. Second, it clearly reinforces distinctions in our society between rich and poor, something we would have thought education mitigated against. Third, it increases the demand to know, or the desire to know, is it worth it? Does it pay off? And that produces, can I have the next slide, please, things like this. The United States government is to issue, just this past Saturday, its college scorecard, in which you can look up any school by a variety of methods or comparable indicators to find out, among other things, how much they cost, how much aid you are likely to receive, and crucially, what your salary you can expect after you graduate. The next slide shows for the University of Pittsburgh. Now, in this case, cost includes cost of living there, shows the graduation rate, and it shows the salary after attending. It shows a whole lot of other things, by the way. This is not a website. I mean, you can't click from here and you have to actually go to the website. It's a remarkable indicator utilizing a variety of things, including a link to the new, supposedly simpler financial aid form. But my point is, it reinforces the question, the idea that college is to get you more salary. Otherwise, why would you spend $30,000 or $40,000 per year to do so? Fourth, it seems to have a career impact on young people. When you graduate with that debt, can you afford to take a job as in the public sector, in a lesser paying area of medicine, in a business area that is less lucrative, if you have such debt to repay? So are we driving society in that direction? Fifth, it seems to contribute to an undervaluing or devaluing of the humanities, because people are inclined to take courses which they think will get them a better job, will be linked to a better job. And that does not mean art, literature, or anything that is not directly related as seen in this instrumental view. Now, this is not a shock to anybody who's been paying attention in the United States. Europe is also not immune from this. In 2012, 2013, the United Kingdom introduced fees for the first time for undergraduates in what had been free education. And so in England and Wales, it now costs up to about £9,000. I think it's about $15,000. That has not happened, however, in continental Europe, where there seems to be broader support for the idea of public taxes supporting education for all in a variety of ways, and a support for channels into other forms of adult life, apprenticeship towards jobs, for example, which seems not to be something supported in the United States, though we have seen an increased interest in supporting community colleges, at least nominally. So the question I'm raising here are a number of questions. How has this happened? What are the implications of it happening this way? And especially for a panel set up by the European Studies Center, what are the differences between Europe and the United States? Can we learn from each other? Is there something the United States can learn from the European practice or the Bologna process that might have implications for the United States? Or conversely, since the United States consistently touts itself as the chief purveyor of Nobel Prizes and creativity and innovation in science, maybe the Europeans have something to learn from us, and maybe they should set up or move towards a system that looks more like ours. In order to answer these questions, we've brought together a distinguished panel whom I will call on in a minute. But first, let me introduce them. Goldie Blumenstyk is a writer for the Chronicle of Higher Education, the Bible for many of us in higher education. She has been there since 1988 and has won many awards for her writing, which include coverage of education in Europe and China. She is the author of American Higher Education in Crisis, ? What Everyone Needs to Know, which was published last year by Oxford University Press. Liudvika Leisyte is a professor at the Center for Higher Education at the Technical University in Dortmund, Germany. She too specializes in higher education and higher education policy. She was a postdoctoral fellow at the Gunsberg Center for European Studies at Harvard. And she continues to work on especially the question of linkages between higher education and industry, topic which I think we will touch on. John Douglas is a senior research fellow at public policy and higher education at the University of California, Berkeley. He is the author of several books on this topic, especially emphasizing global connections, including the new flagship university, Changing the Paradigm from Global Ranking to National Relevancy, and Globalization's Muse, Universities and Higher Education System in a Changing World. Finally, my colleague here at Pitt, John Weidman, is a professor of higher and international educational development in the School of Education. He has done extensive work around the world on higher education, especially its financing. He's done work in Japan and Kenya and Israel and in Germany, and is the co-author of Economics and Finance of Higher Education. Let me begin, since I began with finance, I will execute some privilege and ask my colleague John Weidman to begin by addressing the question of finance. Are we making too much of it? Is the picture I presented just one for shock value? Is it to be expected? Is it really as out of whack as it appears?
Thank you, Ron. I guess I'm a little skeptical about all the doom and gloom books and articles about financing of higher education. And in large part, that's because these represent national policy choices that are made by elected representatives of the citizens of the countries in which we're speaking. It happens that in the United States, along with a few other countries like Japan and Korea, much of the burden of payment for higher education falls on the student because the government authorities have chosen not to fund higher education at a high level. We're talking about 2/3 of the funding for higher education from private sources. That was not always the case in the United States, for example. Last night we had a debate by candidates from one of our political parties in the Ronald Reagan Center, Ronald Reagan Library. And in fact, Ronald Reagan is the benchmark for change in higher education funding policy in the United States. Because when he was president, the funding pattern was just the opposite. About 2/3 was coming from public sources and 1/3 from private. But over the years that has changed because of major policy decisions. As Ron said, we sit here in the University of Pittsburgh, which is the most expensive public university in the United States. And our legislature now can't agree on a budget. So of course, over the years, as the priorities have changed and the funding patterns have changed, so too has the support for public higher education. It's not that the demand has changed. We have a huge demand, and we have plenty of institutions. It's just that the pattern of funding has changed. The question of whether it's too expensive, I think, depends more on who you talk to. The payoffs to higher education continue to be very high all around the world. For those of you who are interested in a nice compendium of statistics, OECD publishes an annual compendium of statistics. There's a section on education and lots of nice tables about expenditures and changes in patterns over about the last decade. They've also published a nice little report which is titled Returns on Higher Education for Individuals. And looking across, again, OECD countries and also others, they find the returns are very high and continue to be very high to individuals. The returns are also very high for countries. So it's the investment is worth it, both for individuals and for countries. The decisions about the investments, though, have been moved much more into the private sphere, in my view. It's much more up to individuals, particularly in the United States, to make the choices about what they're willing to pay, rather than government authorities. And that, in a way, is sort of a worldwide shift to the right, I would say, of political structures and governments.
Thank you, John. Ms. Blumenstyk, let me throw it to you. Are you on? Can you hear me all right? We have to unmute you. I like asking questions. I like hearing the answer even better. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
So you heard Professor Weidman's comment, and you wrote a book about crisis in higher education. Is this part of the crisis? And is it really people getting excited about something that they need not worry about?
No, I think it's a real crisis, and but I also think some of the statistics that you gave earlier almost painted a little more with maybe too broad a brush than what we really need to be looking at. I mean, and it's interesting actually. He talked about there being a decision being made by elected officials. It's pretty hard to find where that decision ever happened. It's not like anyone ever took a vote and said we're going to start cutting state support for higher education beginning in the 1980s and continuing until today with a few blips. It's more a function of how state budgets are structured. Medicaid corrections, some of those things are sort of fixed costs in the budgets, and higher education has tended to not be a fixed cost. And when states get squeezed, they cut state funding. That's what's driving up a lot of the costs. I mean, I would want to make a few comments about the things you said about student debt, which I think are important. I don't know if this is the right time to do that.
Well, I'll come back to you on that. Let me go to you, John, on the question of since it's a public policy issue. Why isn't there more of an outcry about this? Is it a kind of stealth item that slips through without a discrete decision, as you mentioned? But the impact is clear. The OECD statistics support it. Why haven't we heard more about this when we typically hear a lot about other issues that pop up in political discussions?
So you're referring in terms of the U.S. situation with rising tuition and these kinds of factors,
yes.
I presume. Yeah. So, well, I don't know. We got Democratic presidential candidates talking about it and identifying it as a top issue to get them perhaps through the primaries. Each candidate now has some kind of a student debt plan, which is basically to provide some kind of block grants to states, and then the states will be asked to provide some kind of matching funds, and it all focuses on a lot of concern and lots of, you see it in the news all the time about student debt. And, but I think the interesting aspect of those proposals too is that they basically identify what Goldie just noted as well, is that the states have disinvested for a lot of reasons. Some of it relates to the structure of entitlements and how state budgets work. The Great Recession accelerated these trends. And then at the same time, I think you've got a lot of starve the beast Republican conservative policymakers over time eroding away or not seeing value in public higher education, or that it should be something that individuals should invest in for their own private good as opposed to a public good. So in my view, I think it's really quite a large issue out there. The last thing to say is that I also agree with Goldie on this, is that you got to kind of unpack a lot of the data. What the picture that you painted is, those are all real facts, but then you got to kind of disaggregate to get a better understanding. There's over 5,000 different institutions of higher education in various forms in the U.S. And in the U.S., everything in the kitchen sink after high school is higher education. And so there are definitional differences between Europe or other parts of the world and the U.S. But you have to unpack. And just give you one example, 42% of all the students in the U.S. go to 2-year institutions, which is you don't see anywhere else in the world. We also have, to add to this, more part-time students than any other country, any other developed country as well. So there's a whole different dynamic going on there versus the for-profits, which again, I know Goldie's written about quite extensively. I've written a little bit about it too. And if you just look at those numbers, almost half the student debt, if I have this right, about almost half the student debt, those numbers you see are from for-profit institutions, which, are using taxpayer money. So the financial picture is serious about student debt, but you really have to unpack it to kind of really understand what's going on and how severe the crisis is.
I'm going to pick up the question of student debt, but I want to ask a somewhat broader question. I want to address this to you, if I might, Professor Leisyte. It's the social question. And I posed, it always struck me that in the United States, there was this idea that after high school, everyone should go on to college of some sort, even if in practice, financially, it's made very difficult. But there was this notion that it was open to anyone who could manage it or pay for it. Whereas in Europe, that has never been the reigning ethos. Education was really for the elite or for the select, and there were other tracks for other people, producing much lower rates of involvement, and OECD statistics back this up, in tertiary education. Is that a correct characterization, and does that explain to some extent why this is less of a concern in Europe than in the United States?
Very good question. Well, I think I would like to start with a similar argument we heard before, that Europe is a very diverse place. So if we talk about continental European, Western European higher education systems, you have early tracking in schools. So there are students who go to gymnasium and then they are eligible to go to university. And there are students who are taking it, 11-year-olds, for example, in Holland, in the Netherlands, they take an exam and then, they can be rerouted to applied universities or colleges in kind of US sense, where they will be taking practical higher education and will be going to professions. And also they can go into apprenticeships, right? And they can do already practical training in the companies. So you have these various routes and very early decision of will this person go to higher education, meaning university, or other types of higher education. If we look at Central Eastern European countries, again, it's a bit different picture. In the communist period, there was again this, you had to finish your 9 years of education, general education. After 9 years, you could choose to go on and finish the whole gymnasium type of education and then eligible for university, or you could choose professional-oriented education. And again, do apprenticeships in different public companies in those countries. So there's been this choice for elites, as you mentioned, and for other people, so to say, who would like to go and have education, professional education. What we have seen, however, in the last 25 to 30 years is huge expansion and also mission drift. So it's been an understanding that, higher education is accessible to all. And there is more prestige in higher education, which is university education. You can see this drift in the UK example very clearly. In 1992, the two systems of applied sciences universities, those professional, more oriented, and universities proper were merged into one unified system. It became a unitary higher education system. This didn't happen in continental European systems. So neither Netherlands, let's say, or Germany has implemented that. So they remain professionally separated systems. An important thing what happened was in the UK that the status of professional higher education has gone down, which ended up also in lower salaries for people who graduate from this education. So all of a sudden, everyone wanted to go to higher education, university type of education, even if it will be in terms of, preparing engineers for plumbing. So really practically oriented education. However, in the continental European system, this didn't happen. So basically, if you go for higher education that is professional oriented, you do practical training, your salary after graduation is really high. So your status is actually still quite high in the society, which still remained very attractive for a big body of students to go and choose this types of education. I think another very important premise is that education is for free. Okay, so UK is an exception. UK introduced slowly the fees, first 1,000, then there was a cap to 3,000, and now we have 9,000 pounds. But this is really an exception. If you look at most of European continental systems, education is for free. Just to give an example from the German system, in North Rhine-Westphalian state, they tried to introduce the fees, 1,000 euros or 1,500 euros. Students went on the streets. There were riots going on. There was this notion of education, higher education being public good is deeply ingrained in European psyche. If you look at any Nordic countries, especially, for example, Finland, it's given. Students coming from abroad would not pay fees if you are in Finland. So even this, for example, the only drift I can see in terms of fees is the foreign students, outside the EU students. So now, for example, systems like the Netherlands has been tapping into this because the UK increased fees. So the Dutch said, okay, we charge 1,000, 2,000 for master students who come from outside EU. So there has been a slight trend towards fees, but nothing at any rate to what is in the US.
Let me turn to you. Do you think people in the United States view higher education as a public good? Your answer when I first asked you seemed to suggest that this was not that case, that it was something subject to private investment and private manipulation. If we don't see it that way, why don't we?
It's hard to say. I think the tradition that came actually from Europe with the Pilgrims, Cambridge in particular, was the idea that it should be a public good. But over the years, it evolved into the provision by private institutions rather than public institutions. I think too that the way that the notion about social welfare has evolved in the US is that the government is not considered to be nearly as responsible for provision of a range of social welfare things, including education, healthcare. We all know what's happening now with a government effort now to provide universal healthcare. And what that translates into in a conservative period is that legislators, politicians want to keep taxes at a certain level. And they, in fact, campaign on no new taxes. And yet the level of taxation in the US is so much lower than it is in the EU, in Germany, in Austria, in the UK. Individual taxes are 50% or even higher. In Scandinavia, even higher than that. We're down maybe 20, 25%. So it's a much different mentality in that sense. And I think that what has evolved is putting the responsibility on individuals rather than on the state to provide various social services. And that applies to higher education. I think it's still a good buy. It's a bargain. Take, for example, we sit here at the University of Pittsburgh, and I've already said we're the most expensive public university in the United States. Okay, just across the street, we have Carnegie Mellon University, a elite private university. The tuition there is more than 3 times higher than it is here at the University of Pittsburgh. So some parents will make a conscious choice and say, we would rather pay the $17,000 for the University of Pittsburgh than the more than $50,000 that it would cost to go to Carnegie Mellon. So I think it's much more. And then, there's this whole idea of discounting tuition. Hardly anybody ever pays the actual sticker price, so to speak, in the US, because privates have all kinds of scholarships that they give, all kinds of incentives. to bring people, certain of our elite institutions, like let's say Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, guarantee that a student will not have to pay any more than the financial need of their family to attend there. So they will not have debt after school. These private proprietary institutions, however, are a big problem in terms of this overall debt burden. But you can't paint everything in the same color, so to speak.
Right. One of the things, if you go to that college scorecard, it's a really fascinating site. One of the things you can do is plug in the cost of any given institution, but then you can calibrate it by your family income. What is the cost to somebody whose family income is $50,000 a year versus someone who's $100,000? And it does go up somewhat, where the expectation is that someone who has more should pay more. Goldie, you had your hand up before, and I didn't want to forget you. I want to go back to you. Go ahead.
Go back to this notion of the public good and the private good, which is a conversation I guess a lot of us have heard. I mean, not to blame the victim, but to some degrees, the colleges have brought this on themselves. I mean, when I first started at the Chronicle, I remember hearing this statistic all the time about how if you go to college, you'll make $1 million more, over the course of your lifetime. And I can't think of anything that may have added more to that private good discussion than that claim that colleges were making over time. Come to college, you'll make $1 million more over your lifetime. I think that really shifted the debate at a time when people are talking about scarce resources. It's another argument for saying, well, if you're going to make all that money later on in life, we don't need to subsidize tuition quite as much as we used to.
But let me argue with you a little bit. You can understand why an institution would say that, because if instead you said, well, if you come to our institution, you pay $50,000, you'll have a greater appreciation of Yeats. You'll know the difference between Bach and the Baroque. You'll understand about Spanish poetry. That may not measure up, but if you say to somebody over the course of your lifetime, in fact, that exact statistic is on the very first page of
right.
the federal government's college scorecard. $1 million.
It's on the first page. It's not, as someone said, it's not even discounted for like the time value of money. But it's an average number, right? I mean, it's a legitimate average number, but and that's a broad number that you can make an argument about generally about higher education. But if colleges are using that, that's what they have to deliver at some point, right? If you're going to make that claim, you better deliver it. And so that's now the onus has been shifted onto them a little bit more. Deliver it. The scorecard does that in a very
why they would make that. It's understandable why they would make that claim.
I mean, the number was out there. You grab it and you use it. But they took that argument as the argument for public and private higher education,
Right.
But particularly public.
Let me switch to the question of, in the face of this, you wake up and you have taken over an American university. I want to ask you this, John, if I might. What are the strategies that universities are doing to try to deal with this situation that maybe they brought on by themselves, but they're faced with nevertheless?
Brought on, but I don't know. I kind of take a little bit of that that argument makes some sense, but I think people are more savvy consumers than that. But they know there's risk involved. Except for, again, you have to differentiate. So a community college, again, they enroll about 45% of the students. In California, they enroll over 70% of all the students in California are in community colleges. So, people kind of don't really understand where the students are some of the times, I think. But that financial model is very different than a very large research university like Pittsburgh. If we were to talk about those kind of flagship large state universities, we know that they're going down the path to look for a new funding model. It's an experiment because this is all changing in a significant way in the last 15 or so years. The erosion's longer than that in terms of public disinvestment, but really you're just seeing this as a new experiment as to how to function in this world. And so most of these universities are kind of moving to what I call a progressive tuition system. Yes, it has some elements that relate to what the privates do, but the privates don't do enough of it in any really large way. And that is to charge fees for higher income students and pass them on to lower income students. And so at the University of California, for example, and I know this is a similar number almost at most large state public universities, they're taking about 33 cents to the dollar of tuition and putting into financial aid. So that is in addition to obviously federal grants, and sometimes there are states have grant programs for low-income students. It's usually need-based, which is what it should be, not merit. And what I mean by that is need is calculated by your need financially, whereas some institutions, particularly privates, use financial aid to bring in people who could be very wealthy but have really good SAT scores. So there's a different kind of ethic going on. There's a lot of pressure to change that. So then the question comes is, well, how is this model evolving? Is financial aid working? And I am part of a project looking at that at the University of California, and I hope actually we have some data related to Pittsburgh as well to eventually look at it. And what I would say is that it's kind of working. If you look at the University of California, which is a 9 undergraduate campuses, total, it has 240,000 students. So about 20% of that, 25% of that is graduate students. But at the undergraduate level, you're seeing actually, even in through the Great Recession, that the percentages of low-income students has actually marginally increased in this period. Why? Because of the financial aid packages, it appears. Other issues as well, communications to low-income students so they can try to navigate what is an increasingly complicated financial aid picture. A little bit of a squeeze at the middle class, even though there's attempts to try to deal with that, and a slight increase in the percentage of upper income students. So that's just one experiment. Well, what I would say is that it appears that this financial aid model is kind of working, at least at the University of California, but it's a moving target because unless there's a real reversal in public funding for the University of California, for example, or other institutions, the states vary by what's happening in the post-recession era, we're still seeing this creeping increase in tuition. And the question is, well, is there some kind of differential effect on different income groups as tuition continues to go up? So that's kind of good news to some degree. Institutions are struggling to figure out what this new financial model is under the assumption that the level of state funding that we had in the past will never return. That level of state funding was like the European model. It was a common good. You saw it everywhere in the 1960s, very low tuition to no tuition rates. But it's a moving target, and we're entering a new era.
Liudvika, let me come back to you, because one of the strategies that colleges and universities seem to be using to deal with this new era are to make arrangements with the other parts of the private sector, especially corporations. They sell naming rights, they sell the names of laboratories, sometimes professorships, various forms of funding. And of course, some have worried about that and sounded the alarm that this is selling out the independence or the integrity, or could be, of a university in return for the money they need so much. And I know that you focus a little bit on that in your work. I'd like to ask you if, one, is that accurate, and two, is that happening in Europe as well?
Yes, both my research but also wide literature has shown that there's been this blurring of boundaries between industry and academia to some extent. And as the budgets, are becoming scarce, especially the recession, but also in the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years, the managerialism of universities in European context has pushed academics and university management to really look for alternative sources. I mean, the extent of it is not as fierce as it is in the US context. So if we talk about university budget overall, we're talking about state funding from 90% would come from the state to maybe 15 some very entrepreneurial university cases. So, the amount you would be looking at the market would be like roughly 1/3 of the university budget in some cases. So what we've seen that universities, especially technical universities, what's called in European context technology universities, who have a lot of engineering schools. They've been really at the forefront of this movement. And of course, there are a lot of ethical issues, but also issues of academic freedom, professional autonomy. Who is deciding on research topics? Is it the industry driving the whole, topics? What kind of problems will be solved, or is it still academics? And are we really doing good science here? That's one of the issues. The other issues is the study side, teaching and learning side. So I don't know if you've heard about, of course, you've heard of Bologna process. And one of the tenets of Bologna process is employability. And this has also transfigured in some way quality assurance systems for education, for higher education. That means that employers, future employers from industry, are in the committees that are evaluating the quality of higher education. So, there is a more and more demand for universities to have people from industry. They can be alumni, they can be from policy sphere, to sit on the committees that are determining what curriculum will be offered in different programs. So part of this is regulated. So certain countries have laws where, especially when it comes to intellectual property rights, and this is a bit similar to the US. In many ways, Bayh-Dole has been copied in all sorts of shapes and forms in European contexts, sometimes not really understanding how it works in the US. So you have a very, very interesting regulatory patterns in Europe on this. But basically, in many ways, universities are owning the property, the intellectual property, and there are very strict agreements that have to be followed for the industry. Having said that, we see that in certain areas, especially engineering and biosciences, life sciences, there is a very conscious move from bottom up, from academics, to engage with industry or to be entrepreneurial, create their own companies and patent. So it's not that, if the university takes all the property rights, that they are not interested anymore to do that. At the same time, the level of entrepreneurialism varies a lot in the European context. East Central European countries, for example, it depends on the science base. So some of them are strong, let's say, in life sciences traditionally, so they would be following this path, while industry capacity is also very different. So, for example, following the European Lisbon agenda and the push and priority of modernization of agenda of the EU, all the countries are supposed to commit to entrepreneurship universities and to industry collaborations. I've been doing some work in the Czech Republic. I did an R&D audit in the Czech Republic. And what we see there, they got money to boost their research infrastructure. So they updated all the laboratories in the country, and they provide opportunities for students to work with industry. At the same time, they cannot really afford to pay good salaries for top scientists. So they cannot attract human capital that is vital to work in these laboratories. So there are very different issues and problems at different levels, and there is a lot of variety when it comes to university-industry collaborations. But ethical issues are very, very important, and sometimes they are regulated by the contracts and regulatory agreements of the states, and sometimes they are terra incognita, especially in Central Eastern European countries. There is a lot of moonshining from professors and things like that. And it's a big concern, I think, both for the industry side, but also for the university side, because universities are losing a lot of intellectual knowledge.
When I used to travel a lot in East Europe in my other life, I would meet faculty from universities who would give me an arm's length full of business cards because they were faculty members at several different universities, which was the only way they could, of course, make a living. And what their actual capacity to do their job effectively in 6 different places.
We call them taxi professors. They have to take taxis from one place to another to make on time to teach in different places.
Well, that actually leads me to a question I'm going to pose to my colleague John. One of the strategies that apparently is being used at American universities under cost pressure is increasingly to hire people who are not full-time tenure stream faculty members on the standard path, which is a commitment by the university for many, many years, but instead to hire non-tenure stream people on contracts or adjuncts or part-time and pay them, frankly, as little as they can get away with. I guess my question to you, John, is, and there was a notorious case in Pittsburgh last year where an adjunct faculty member at Duquesne University actually died, not from her salary, but one of the effects of living on such a penurious salary was that she didn't have access to decent health care or even the stuff of life. And my question to you, John, is that something we're seeing increasingly and are likely to see more of? Or is that a practice that's always gone on that just now has come to light? And is it an effective strategy? Can places really keep down costs by doing that?
Well, undoubtedly they can keep costs down because they don't pay very much, they don't pay benefits.
That's right, they don't pay benefits either.
And that was the problem with the woman here at Duquesne. Even though she might have been working 60 hours a week, she had no health care benefits. So this is a problem. I also think that certain institutions may wish to do that in order to cut costs, but there are implications for quality of the offerings. So the quality is always problematic, I think, in instances where those who are teaching really aren't attached in a significant way to the institution. They come and go, they may have an office, they may not. They don't necessarily have access to instructional resources, technology, other things. So I think there are lots of problems there. I think that Goldie with and the Chronicle have written quite a bit on part-time faculty. She might want to weigh in on this one.
Please.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the decline in the tenure track, I think it's down to roughly 25% now of tenured and tenure track faculty across the board in higher education, where it was something like 40% when I finished college back in the late 70s. But it's been, there's been this commensurate rise in what the critics would call bloat, administrative bloat, and what universities might just call bureaucracy or administration. So I'm continuing to be baffled by this notion of cutting tenured faculty as a money-saving thing, because the universities at the same time need to then hire a whole raft of other people to do the jobs that some of the faculty members used to do before, with a lot more advising and a lot more, sort of managing student affairs. I've yet to see some very good analysis on whether or not this saves money. What it does do, it gives the university administrations and deans and the like a lot more flexibility in how they want to run, with fewer, if you have fewer tenure track people in your departments, you can shift emphases and focus. And there's probably some, arguments for that, and obviously some concerns about quality. I share those concerns as well. But the idea of making departments a little bit more flexible is sort of a valuable one as well. I do think there's been a little bit of a backlash. I mean, the Congress even had hearings on this a couple of years ago, and they talked about this as like piecework for higher education. I come from a family of coat manufacturers, so I understood that analogy pretty well.
Well, we are used to, I've now lived in Pennsylvania for almost 40 years, and whenever the legislature has nothing else to do or they can't deal with any real issues, they trot out universities and bash them for one thing or another, administrative bloat, or actually even being hostile to the goals of the state, or what's all this about tenure and faculty members who quote unquote don't work 4 months of the year, and then eventually they find something else to occupy their time. In American politics, you never lose any time or faith by bashing the intellectuals and the university. It seems to me, and this goes to the question of reversing public funding.
John had a thing there.
There are other I'm sorry?
I think John had a question to raise there on this point.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Nuance to the story, I think. Again, at least if you look, you got to disaggregate again because there are big differences between institutional types. And I'll go back to the community colleges. They're the biggest they're the ones that have the biggest percentage of temporary faculty, and it's definitely highly correlated with financial stress. And they don't have large bureaucracies of staff. They have some, but it depends on the school and where it is. If it's in a rich neighborhood, it'll have more staff, like Santa Monica or something. But 70% or something like that are part-time. And then if you go to a more comprehensive regional institution, and I just use the example that I know, and that's the California State University, it's really, I think it's up to 50% or something, and has grown tremendously. And what I would say is, my understanding really is that it's extremely stressful for these institutions, and faculty actually spend more time in the administrative aspect, the small number that are left, because they have to hire temporary people all the time. This is a huge administrative burden for the faculty. Never mind the other issues that John brought up about quality and not having faculty available for mentoring students, which is still a highly important component of particularly four-year institutions, but any institution. And then if you go up to the more elite institutions, like a Pittsburgh or a Carnegie Mellon or well, no, I won't say Carnegie Mellon, they're too rich, but a University of California. And, we've always historically, I know the historical data on lectures, we've always had about 30% of our lecturers, of our faculty have been lecturers. And that's kind of crept around, but it's relatively stable. Then the final thing just to say about bureaucracy is absolutely, there's a tremendous growth in staff support. But I think you can also, and some of it is administrative bureaucracies like to feed on themselves and create more bureaucracy, absolutely. But you can see a correlation also, particularly in these large research universities, public universities, with the activity and research activity of faculty, particularly in the sciences. They require team research now, and they have large staffing support needs that just didn't exist 50 years ago or 30 years ago. And then the other that is often brought up is the amount of regulations coming out from the federal government related to federal grants, both student aid, but also research grants and affirmative action and other kinds of civil liberties related activity. And you see a correlation with that. But you do see growth in student services as well, which gets back a little bit to this idea that students are clients and that we need to support them in every aspect of their lives when they come to a large research university where they live and breathe on the campus. So I just wanted to add those things.
Thank you. Go ahead, John.
I have one observation, since I'm getting to the later stages now of my career. One of the actual opportunities that universities are presented with in many parts of the world is professors who've been forced to retire from public institutions. Germany is an example of this. Anywhere from 55 to age 65, they're still alert, they're still lively, they're very good, but they can't work in public universities. So they take a job in a private university and make some very real contributions. And they may not continue on a full-time basis. They have access to the retirement and other pension kinds of things. So they actually make a contribution as part-time, but very senior and experienced faculty members, having left the public sector and moving to the private.
Yes, indeed. One of our colleagues at Cologne, Professor Wolfgang Wessels, who headed our counterpart EU center there, was terrific, well known, and obliged to retire, I think, at 65. I hope he does find a way to stay on. One of the other strategies, and you've written on this, John, under the global university, that universities use, is to get more people who will pay the full ticket price, including especially more students from countries that are sending, that have become affluent and are sending their students abroad, China being the prime example. There's a race to acquire the most full ticket paying students. China's first, Turkey, Germany. Is this an unseemly race for purchasers without the support, or is this just what you might expect in what is essentially a private dog-eat-dog world? And are there
Both.
things we should worry about that? It's both.
I'd say it's both. But I will say this. Okay, so for privates, for example, international students out of state doesn't matter. They charge the same amount, right? So it's interesting that the University of Southern California has the largest number of international students of any institution, but it's not really a financial-driven decision-making. I think it relates to their efforts to change their image and increase SAT scores, these kinds of things. On the publics, it's a very clear picture that relates to what you just said, and that is you have a disinvestment by the state, and we can calculate in that in different ways. The best way usually is to say, well, what are they paying per student to support the institution? There's an expense side too, and how expensive can institutions control their costs, things like that. But basically, you have this huge disinvestment, and so they've gone searching. These institutions, the public universities and colleges, have gone search, and even community colleges are going and searching for international students because they can charge a higher rate. They have the legal ability or other kinds of structural abilities to do this. It's sanctioned by the state often in terms of being able to charge out-of-state fees. And so at a place like Berkeley, for example, absolutely, the growth in international students and out-of-state from around 3% to now about around 20% has been all about the money. And of course, this raises many different issues. It relates to, are we displacing Californians, for example, at the undergraduate level to come into the institution? So it's a hot debate. I will say it's an interesting political shift here because many states, including California, had agreements with their state legislatures that they would have only a small percentage, sometimes an actual agreed number of like 3 or 4% of out-of-state students that they would allow. That's before the Great Recession. But with the Great Recession, the politics really changed a lot. I mean, we've had a slow erosion, again, of legislatures, particularly in Republican states, shall I say, but everywhere not seeing value in putting money into public education. But you had this kind of agreement. And then when everything hit the fan, which really it did in terms of state finances with the Great Recession, those issues of limits kind of went away, and everybody thought, well, whatever it takes to keep going, and the lawmakers didn't get that upset. But now we've more recently come back to the issue, and they're seeing this high percentage of international students, particularly at the flagship universities, and it's depending on the economic model in the state. And now it's a really big and an important issue as well. But it really relates highly to disinvestment by state legislatures.
Goldie, I'm going to come to you in a second, but John, I want to question you on one thing you said, that it's really not so much of an issue for the privates because they charge the same, but doesn't a place like USC not offer the same aid packages to, let's say, affluent students from China or from Germany, where they would have to do that in the United States? So the net gain that they get is much larger, even though they charge the same.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on that. I don't know the numbers, but yeah, they probably are making some money off it. You're right.
It's shocking.
But I think sometimes it relates more to, I'm not sure, but maybe the elites. It's not the money so much, but it's getting talent. But maybe you go down the ranking list or something, and that dynamic becomes different. But it's a good observation.
Before I go to you, Goldie, I want to read a wonderful quote from William Deresiewicz, whom I'm sure you've all read, talking about the elites. He's issued many screeds bashing the elites, and he talks about how they've created, and he thinks crippled, American education because they create timid, unquestioning, but high-achieving students. He talks about how they treat international students, and he says, kids at school like Stanford think their environment is diverse if one comes from Missouri and another from Pakistan, or if one plays the cello and the other lacrosse. Never mind that all their parents are doctors or bankers. And he criticizes it on those grounds. We'll come back to him. Goldie, I promise to come to you.
Yeah, let's hope we can disaggregate some of that data in that book as well. I have a question, actually. I mean, obviously, the United States imports a lot of students, and we're big, and that's one of the reasons we're the #1 importer of students. But the UK and Australia have been doing this for quite a long time, and I guess I don't know as much about this as I should, but I'm wondering if some of our other panelists can help me understand. Have they been doing that also for has there been a financial benefit for UK and Australia by importing international students?
That's the reason. If you look at the UK and Australia, 20% to 25%, I don't know what the number is right now, of their entire income for operating their higher education systems come from international students.
So they charge them.
Early on, Australia was the first mover, said, hey, we have a market, we can provide funding for our institutions this way. I think, there are probably some other more altruistic reasons, but that's the big reason, and they made no bones about it. And the UK did the same process. Obviously, there's a huge advantage to having English. In New Zealand, to some extent too, having English as a language for programs makes that's the lingua franca of the world now. So that's provides an advantage.
And have any of those countries faced the same issues that we see starting to see in the States, where concerns about too many out-of-state, out-of-nation students coming in and taking spots? They have more
Absolutely.
limited spaces.
Yes, it's a debate. You see it in the UK. It also integrates into migration issues generally. By taking students in, are we creating future citizens? Is that good or is it bad? And so there's lots of debates around that. All similar, but there are some big differences too, I think, just historically in the U.S.
Liudvika, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add in the European context. So, as I said, outside the EU, students are really, in a way, seen as cash cows for many universities. And what we've seen since the fees went up in the UK, you could see that certain countries in continental Europe followed suit and became very aggressive in their marketing of their, especially master level programs. For example, the Netherlands, they've been really very aggressive in terms of, they have some fees, but around 1,000 euros or something like that. So they've been really targeting Asia, especially, to attract students to come to the Netherlands. And talking about the issues of this balance between local students and foreign students. So the usual targets in the Dutch situation would be around 10% of foreign students. And the way it would work, that many German students would come to the Netherlands. So the foreign student, let's say Maastricht University, foreign students, they in some programs like psychology, I just had an interview with the vice rector of Maastricht University, and he was very concerned. He's German himself, and said, 25% of students are German, and they are international students, and they are paid from the more or less taxpayers' money because they contribute 1,000 or something like that. But they are also EU students, so then you cannot charge very high fees. So there is a very big policy debate between the Dutch government and German government to say, why are we funding your students? Yeah, so there is a very multi-level problem then in the system where the tuition fees don't cover the cost, like partly in the US. Then who is paying? It's the government that is paying. So why the government should be educating other nations' students? So I think there are very interesting multi-level issues popping up because of this mobility. It's not very straightforward. When I interviewed students from Finland and also from Germany who come from abroad, I have a lot of Chinese students in my class in Germany. The question is, why did you choose to come to Germany? Because you need to learn German. In schools, they study English and then they have to learn another language. They say, well, because it's for free, or it's very minimal for us. So it's again, saying, okay, there's outcrowding from the expensive systems. Let's go for the cheaper systems.
I recognize when I began. I'm sorry. Go ahead, John.
But just a brief, and that is, there's a real big difference depending on the country. Is it growing in population? Is it shrinking in population? Is the nation state looking for policies to bring more people in? Germany is a good example. I mean, never mind the more urgent issues related to Syrian migration, but to bring in talented people to help boost the population levels. So, and Canada is like that. Japan is trying, for example. So that the issues are a little bit different too, though. So when you talk about a state like California, in much of the U.S., not all of the U.S., we're growing in population. So there's other pressures related to capacity of our higher education institutions. Can they take additional domestic students and international students? I would say that's the balance. I mean, we should be doing that, but it takes capital to do that, and so a lot of tension.
Maybe one thing which I didn't forgot to mention, there's been a lot of move from Central Eastern European countries to Western European countries of students. So mobility has been within the European Union, so to say, because education is for free for them, right? Because they are EU citizens. And I think what John mentions is extremely important, because if you take countries, for example, Baltic states, I'm Lithuanian myself, 40% demographic downturn coming in the next 10 years in higher education in Lithuania. That means some universities might need to close, or they find other students from outside. So it's a survival issue. Let's say if you take in the Netherlands, those universities, Maastricht I mentioned, Twente is very aggressive in internationalization, Utrecht, Groningen. For them, again, it's a demographic partly issue because the local students are going down. In Germany, the students are increasing. I have last year, for example, they had a double Abitur, which means 2 years of graduates all of a sudden entered a higher education. There are no entrance exams, it's free. So, we have way too many students. So I think this demographic issue is very, very important.
I recognized when we began that we had partners who are watching this from other institutions, and I'd like to give them an opportunity to ask a question if any of them would like to. Just need to see your hand and we'll plug you in. Yes, Carly. Kristen. Okay, can you hear me?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
I wanted to thank you very much for all the debate and between Europe and the United States. For me, I did both Europe and the United States for the higher educations. And in the past, it was a dream for Europeans to go to the United States to study. And it is still, I would say, even if you see more and more Americans who are coming to Europe, we see a difference. So the European students want to go still in the States to study. And even if there is a recession, it is important nowadays in all the strategy international in Europe to go abroad, because to be competitive, you need for a student to have everything, and a bachelor is not enough. Neither in Europe or in the United States nowadays, and you see that everybody wants to have a master degree and they can do otherwise. Now I have a question for Liudvika. It is regarding the strategy international. Have you seen in your strategy for these years more and more double diploma that you want to extend from Europe to the United States?
Thank you very much for your question. In terms of double diploma, I've seen a lot of within European collaborations happening, especially the EU programs like Erasmus. Now we have Erasmus Plus. People will be definitely tapping into this source of funding and creating programs that cross borders in 2-3 countries, and providing funding for students to come from outside EU as well, and thereby attracting really great talent from across the world. In terms of US and European, I haven't seen too much of a movement. I know there are agreements signed on both sides, and I know more about research funding. So there are NSF and the European Research Council, they have been writing agreements to collaborate and give money for on both sides of the Atlantic. However, in double degree diplomas, I haven't seen much of a movement, but it might be my knowledge because that's not my area of expertise.
At the University of Pittsburgh, one of the quickest ways to get kicked out of a meeting is to suggest a double degree with another university. But we have tried to take advantage of the opening of the Erasmus program to American institutions for the first time, as well as other programs like Horizon 2020. And we will have a briefing on that program at the end of this month. We've tried to take advantage of it, but talk about two cultures. We have a clash of an American university legalistic administrative culture and a European EU bureaucratic legalistic structure. And my grandchildren will be in this chair, I think, before it actually comes to fruition. But we received a question through our Blue Jeans connection that Allison will now read.
Yes, we have a question from one of the viewers that's participating remotely, and he asks, how do liberal studies or general education credit requirements add to time to degree and thus to total cost of a degree?
Go ahead, John.
I respond generally, the way that degrees are structured in the United States, those requirements really don't add to time to degree. It's still, the basic theory is 4 years. People take longer for other reasons, but it still tends to be possible to complete everything. And that's, we differ particularly from Europe on this, in that a lot of areas that we consider to be professional areas, even law and medicine, we require that 4-year base, and then students move to the professional studies. But by and large, with the exception of some fields, the general education requirements do not add time to the 4-year bachelor's degree.
I want to also offer our patient and engaged audience here at Pittsburgh, which include, unless I'm wrong, some international students. I want to give them an opportunity to ask a question of any of our panelists as well.
Okay.
Please.
So it is really,
Speak up loudly.
it is really astonishing to hear that a lot of the institutions, they're actually offering the international program mainly for the money. And I never thought about it really. And it is interesting. I also want to ask the question, why will you educate some foreigners and who will maybe not stay in your country and contribute to your country? And will it lead to like a deliberate, bad instruction, not bad, but not so good instruction towards those international students? So that's my question. How do you balance? Maybe you unconsciously will try to, not conduct so much knowledge to the international students.
Well, that's a higher level of conspiracy theory, I must say, than I've heard in the past. Goldie, let me see if you want to respond to that question about educating foreigners who don't stay.
It's a very big issue at the research university, right? Aren't there even some research projects that foreign nationals aren't allowed to be involved with in some cases? So in some cases, it's not sort of a subtle, quiet thing. It's a very explicit and direct and open thing when there's concerns about national security and other issues. I don't think it's purely for the money that these schools are going after these international students. Obviously, there is an interest in internationalizing the campus. Some colleges, though, do a better job than others in actually integrating international students into the daily fabric of the campus. So I think a good measure of whether your school is interested in international students for the money or for the broader issues might be just to look at the programs that they have to sort of integrate the students more broadly into the institution.
I would say, from my own experience at the University of Pittsburgh, which has made the same sort of trajectory that John described in California, when I first came here, there was absolute opposition to too many, not just out of country, but even out of state. Why are we educating people from New Jersey as if they're some aliens or something? And gradually that has changed. one of the things that's changed and I think will continue is the idea that university is reinventing itself as with a global purpose. Now that means we want to educate people about other parts of the world and send them there, but it also means, especially a public university where incomes are not high, we globalize students by introducing them to students from other parts of the world who they might not otherwise meet. There are even some programs called not study abroad, but study away, where you go to a different part of the state where there's a Somali community or a Korean community. And it has an enormous value to a student who's grown up in Western Pennsylvania and never met anybody from China or Japan, and now they do. So there's a real gain. But John,
I was just.
Go ahead, Goldie. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just curious about something that someone raised earlier about, the reluctance of universities to issue these joint degrees. I know a lot of universities create branch campuses overseas, often in collaboration with these other universities. So what's the point if they're not actually developing joint degrees? And I think Carnegie Mellon.
Branch campuses, unless John can correct me, I think they do that because they control the degree and it's their degree. It's like NYU in Qatar or in Shanghai or something, or CMU in Italy. They're their degrees in another country, but it's not a joint degree with two institutions. But I could be wrong.
No, I think you're right, but I guess I don't get it. Why wouldn't you want to just really do some better integration with another institution if you've bothered to set up a shop there?
Well, I don't know the full answer to that, but I would say this is that the branch campus phenomena is a very boutique phenomena. The numbers are very small. Most of them in the U.S. that you see are from private institutions, very few public, because the money is not the sustainability. There are issues relating to finances that are just very different in a public institution. So the branch campus phenomena is, kind of gets a lot of attention, but it's not a big impact kind of player, I would say, generally. But and then if we're talking about joint degree programs, I think one of the phenomena, two things I would make an observation. One, American higher education is still very provincial, even though we have faculty engaged in all these international activities and stuff, is, just not that interested in the world around them in the way that the Europeans are or much of Asia is. I mean, I'm not saying there isn't interest and there isn't a lot of international interaction, but it's just not the same in terms of collaborations between institutions. Joint programs, or what we're talking about, joint degree programs, are a lot of work. And I think institutions are inundated by requests by various international universities to be engaged in this because this is their idea of being to be internationalized, and there's just kind of a reluctance to deal with it.
Before I leave you, John, I want to ask you if there's any data that responds to the question you had about why we would educate foreigners. Are there any data on the number of students who come from foreign countries and don't go back and wind up staying here and contribute to our society as Americans?
Yes, the National Science Foundation and others have it. Again, you do have to disaggregate a little bit. Sorry, that's my favorite theme. But the graduate level is a very different story. We've always had a very significant portion of international students internationally, and most engineering programs have about 60 or more percentage of their students are international. And but the thing is that's been part of the attractiveness is, one, the U.S. is a land of immigrants. We integrate people into our society. We've had pathways with some limitations towards citizenship, and that's a big factor for stay rates, obviously. And many countries have dramatically changed their pathways to citizenship, including, I'm coming back to Germany. I'm in Berlin at the moment, and I'm learning more about what they're doing to try to attract talent. So I don't know the full numbers, but I did recently look at stay rates for people in graduate programs in science and engineering, and it's about, for PhDs, it's about 62, 65%. The data always lags a little bit. So the U.S. has a long history of stay rates because does have a pathway for citizenship. But the other parts of the world are catching up and being much more innovative and much more competitive. So we'll see if we've always been able to attract some of the best talent. We still will, but it's just that the world is going to be more fluid.
Indeed. Liudvika, you had your hand up.
Yeah, a couple of issues. Just to pick on the last one, just to give some examples of competition, I think is the key word here, and we need to really specify it. For example, if we talk about students, that's one story, but if we talk about PhD level already and researchers, the mobility of researchers in creation of European research area, mobility is one of the cornerstones of that document. And you can see, different schemes that are really trying to attract talent, global talent, to Europe at the European level. So Europeanization project, that's one story. The other project, of course, is national and institutional competition. For example, the Netherlands, since a couple of years, they have a tax break for people who come to the country to work here. As someone mentioned, taxes are high. 50% tax is quite normal for professoriate level in the Netherlands, for example. So you would have a 30% tax break if you come and work in the Netherlands as a high educated scholar. In Germany, you have also attraction, different policies for staff and for students. And especially this is about talent, of course, attracting the top scholars, attracting the top students as well, sometimes giving them scholarships if it's outside the EU. And so the same kind of games and mechanisms as we've seen in the US, I would say penetrating EU basically because of the competition for talent. So my argument for partly why to have international students is to select the best students to be and work in your lab. For example, when I started my PhD in Nottingham University in the UK, none of my year PhD grad students, my colleagues, were English. All were international, as I was. Zero English. And I thought, hello, am I in the UK? Where am I? So for me, it was a bit of a puzzle to understand what is going on. Then if I studied labs quite a bit in the US, for example, in chemistry field, in one university, actually in Pennsylvania as well. And, in engineering and sciences, 2/3, if not more, of the lab were international. Yeah, so this competition for talent is really an important factor.
Well, loath as I am to draw this to a close, I have a reason which all of you, especially on the panel, will understand. We are about to have a visit, believe it or not, from the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Education of the United States government. We learned this only last week. It is the section of the Department of Education which supports our center, among other things. So we've had to put on quite a series of events, and he is arriving even as we speak. Nevertheless, I would be calling us to a close in any case because I don't want to presume much more on all of the panelists or our audience for their time. So let me take this opportunity to thank you, Goldie and John and Liudvika and my colleague John Weidman. Thank all of you at the various audience hosts and the audience here. And I hope you will. I hope you have enjoyed yourself, and we'll come back again for another conversation on Europe. Thank you.